Lieutenant Colonel Lincoln S. Farish here, with my trusty pipe hawk. I'm still on safari, but it's time for another presentation. I once had a co-worker who liked to make assertions without evidence, and would sometimes dig his feet in a little bit when you challenged him on it. And for whatever reason, he thought that the US had supported Al-Qaeda at some point. Now, it's ridiculous on its face, but just to make sure that I completely destroyed that argument, I did some research. And this presentation is a version of that. Because I've always said, if you're going to make an assertion, back it up with some evidence. So in any event, let's get started. But remember, these are my thoughts. Not DoD, US Army, USK, or SWCC. Lincoln S. Farish's thoughts. I made this presentation because of a coworker. There are three reasons someone would say the US supported Al-Qaeda: ignorance, trolling, and conspiracy thinking. The way to counter this is by discussion. I'll get into how to discuss in another video, but for now, when I say discussion, I mean a calm, not personally invested recitation of facts. This way you avoid rhetorical traps, logical fallacies, and tone policing. Those who are regurgitating what someone else has said, the ignorant, the ill-informed, now have facts instead of edgy opinion. The trolls don't have the emotional response they crave, and while the conspiracy-minded live in their own world, if there's an audience, you may sway their opinion on the matter to your side. Lastly, you're not letting someone else define you, your military service, or your country. Afghanistan's never really been a peaceful place. In 1973, it was a monarchy. Mahmud Khan deposed his cousin, the king, and established the Republic of Afghanistan, which lasted for about 5 years, until in turn Muhammad Khan was deposed by Soviet-backed communists. Khan and most of his family are assassinated, and this begins a civil war, because from 1826 to 1978, Pashtuns were in charge. When the commies take over, there's a giant power grab by the other ethnicities and groups. So the civil war is led, for the most part, by warlords of ethnic tribes. And these kind of power grabs and coup d'etat are consistent throughout Afghan history. Afghanistan followed the French model of revolution, which essentially is kill as many enemies as you possibly can, run the place on the ground, while enacting some things that are positive. Basically trading one tyrant for another. So Nur Muhammad Taraki took over after the royal family had all been assassinated or driven away, and he disappears his political enemies. He enacts some land reforms, which fail, so now people are hungry. Now, he did get rid of feudal practices like usury, bride price, and forced marriage. Minimum age of marriage was raised. Government stressed education for both men and women, and launched an ambitious literacy campaign. He also got rid of Sharia law, and men were encouraged to cut their beards off. But remember, with any change, there's a compromise. Someone gains in power, some people lose power. Unsurprisingly, Taraki was assassinated in September 1979, having been in power for about a year. Despite getting rid of Taraki, the people of Afghanistan are still hungry and they're still irritated. Into the scene steps Hafizullah Amin. He takes over. Country's in flames. And then the Soviets invade in December of 1979. So Hafizullah Amin is captured and then executed, his reign going from September to December of 1979, which is not the shortest reign in Afghanistan. Additionally, all of Amin's male members are executed, and the female members are sent to prison. Getting rid of one tyrant to replace with another does not put food into the bellies of the Afghan people, and they're still upset. Even with the Soviet 40th Army, Babarak Karmel, who's the new communist president, can't stop the anti-government uprisings. The US gets involved, and they do this through Operation Cyclone, and they provide direct support, money, weapons, to displaced Afghans and Afghan mujahideen. And this started essentially right after the Soviets invaded in December of '79. It lasted for about 10 years. Previously, there had only been a token amount of non-lethal aid that was easy to get. But when you're talking big things, money, arms, weapons, and training, how do you do that? Well, you've got to funnel it through Pakistan. At this time, Pakistan has its own issues. Relations between the US and Pakistan had been strained since they'd executed Prime Minister Bhutto. Mohammed Zia al-Haq was the current president under martial law. He was the architect of Pakistan's Islamization. Now, Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, the ISI, was the required intermediary for weapons and money. And one of the people they chose to work with was a person named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and he's beyond controversial. Hekmatyar was accused of spending more time fighting other mujahideen than Soviets, of playing both sides when it suited his purposes, of killing members of the media, especially foreign media, hijacking medical convoys. He never won a significant battle versus the Soviets, and towards the end, Hekmatyar became one of the largest heroin producers in the region. Also, Hekmatyar and his group were one of the largest recipients of aid coming from the Saudis and other Arab states. Also towards the end, Al-Qaeda is formed. It was a militant Sunni Islamist multinational organization, or is now. At the time, it was mostly for Arab mujahideen. It was founded in August of '88 by Osama bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam. The reason for this was money and arms from the U.S. went for Afghan mujahideen, not Arab mujahideen. So to fill this gap, Al-Qaeda was formed. Azzam convinced bin Laden to personally finance the training of recruits. So bin Laden used his own money to train Al-Qaeda and other Arab mujahideen. Sadly and mysteriously, in November of '89, Azzam was assassinated, a crime which has never been solved to this day, and Osama bin Laden took over the organization. That was all in Pakistan. Meanwhile, back in Afghanistan, the Soviets have realized they've bitten off more than they can chew and announced in July of 1987 the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, with the last Soviets leaving in February of 1989. So to recap, the Soviets announced in 1987 they're leaving. Al-Qaeda is formed in 1988. The last Soviet leaves in February of 1989, and Azzam is mysteriously assassinated in November of 1989. You would think that after the Soviets left, Afghanistan would return to peace, and you'd be wrong. After the Soviet withdrawal, the conflict for Afghanistan just turned into a 7-way civil war. 6 mujahideen groups and the PDPA, which was the communist government in Kabul. President Abdullah, who had been around since '87, tried to build support for his government, but it didn't work. The warlords either wanted to be in charge or to make sure their rival warlords weren't in charge. This culminates in the Battle of Jalalabad, which started in March of '89 and lasted until June. Technically, it was a win for the government. However, Afghanistan's been crushed and is broke. They were a client state of the Soviets. The Soviet Union is broke. There's no money coming in. There's no aid coming in. There's no infrastructure to move anything around. You can't trade. You can't move food. And it gets worse. Finally, it got so bad the UN had to come in. In April of '92, the UN presented a plan to the mujahideen parties, which was accepted. They formed a pre-interim council, flew into Kabul. Part of the deal was that President Abdullah would resign from office. The mujahideen forces were supposed to stay out. It was approved by everybody. And then it wasn't. President Abdullah had attempted to exile in India. But Dostum, who was working for the Kabul government, abandoned Abdullah and blocked his route to the airport. Abdullah stayed at the UN compound trying to get India to grant asylum. And that's where he stayed until 26 September 1996. So this peace attempt was called the Peshawar Accords. It was an attempt to form a coalition government. And it failed because, of course, none of the warlords trusted each other. The moment President Abdullah resigned in April, civil war flared up over control of Kabul between 5 different armies, most of them mujahideen. And interestingly, most of them were sponsored by foreign states or intelligence agencies. By the end of 1992, thousands in Kabul had been killed. 500,000 had fled. Kabul itself severely damaged. Groups would form alliances, then break them. Peace accords were attempted and failed, and then war expanded over all of Afghanistan. This goes on for 2 years. No one's making any progress. The entire country is in flames. And then the Taliban appear. Sponsored by the ISI, the Taliban was mostly Pashtun students from radical madrasas. They gradually gained the upper hand, and by September of 1996, they had conquered Kabul. Abdullah, who had fled to the UN compound, was seized, castrated, and then his body dragged through the streets and publicly hanged. The same treatment was given to his brother. So what about al-Qaeda? Well, following the Soviet Union's withdrawal, there's not much need for Arab Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia, where he was treated like a hero, worked in the family business. However, he started to engage in opposition to the Saudi monarchy, and he was angered by the constant tribal fighting amongst the Afghans. About a year later, Iraq invades Kuwait, and the U.S. assists in the defense. Osama bin Laden criticizes the government for allowing Americans to reside in Saudi Arabia and gets expelled in 1991. Tries to go to Afghanistan, but can't, so he ends up going to Sudan. Once in Sudan, things worked out pretty well for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The problem was, other terrorist groups started to show up as well, and Western intelligence started to focus on what was going on. Eventually, the U.S. and others compelled Sudan to kick out all these various groups, to include al-Qaeda. Weaker, poorer, and with fewer followers, Osama bin Laden made a deal with the Taliban leader Mohammed Omar for protection in Afghanistan. And then, in August of 1996, he declared war on the U.S. September 11th happens. The U.S. invades Afghanistan when the Taliban refused to hand over al-Qaeda. Bin Laden fled Afghanistan during the Battle of Tora Bora in December of 2001 and hid out in the northwest frontier province of western Pakistan. We eventually discovered where he was, conducted a raid, and he died on May 2nd, 2011. So, important points here. Al-Qaeda was formed in 1988. This was after the Soviets had announced that they were leaving Afghanistan. And al-Qaeda was composed mostly of Arab Mujahideen who didn't receive money from the U.S. Osama bin Laden used his own money to fund the Arab Mujahideen, and he had no problem with the U.S. until 1990. At this point, you can expect the goalpost to move with an attempt to blame Afghanistan's woes on external forces, specifically the United States somehow. Again, discuss the problem without passion, just lay out the facts. Now, from about the 1200s, Afghanistan was under Mongol control with Genghis Timur Babur. Eventually, this changed over to Persian rule until 1709, when Marwaz Hatak revolted and became the first emir of Afghanistan in the greater Kandahar region. Marwaz is succeeded by his brother Aziz, but Aziz was killed in 1717 by his nephew Mahmud Hotak. Then Mahmud, in turn, was murdered in 1725 by his cousin Ashraf Hotaki. With the problems of succession, the Afsharid from Persia saw an easy chance to invade and take over, which is what they did, and they became the Durrani in 1747. The Durrani eventually fade off into nothingness, and Dost Muhammad Khan in 1826 with the Barzaki take over, and they rule more or less until 1973. So for 150 years, Afghanistan was ruled by Afghans. There were a couple breaks. The first Anglo-Afghan War, British lost. Dost Muhammad Khan retakes the throne. Second Afghan War, the British win, pick the king and leave, established the Durrani line in 1883. But then the third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919 occurs, and the Afghans win, and British allow independence so long as you keep the Durrani line intact. Another important point, very few Afghan rulers died of old age. So just in case you need it, here's a recap. Operation Cyclone was from 1979 to about February 89. Supplies were sent to Pakistan, and the ISI then funneled that to Afghan Mujahideen, leaving Arab Mujahideen out in the cold. The Soviets began to withdraw from Afghanistan in 1987. Al-Qaeda was founded in August of 1988 for the Arab Mujahideen with money and equipment procured by Osama bin Laden. Afghanistan has had a long and bloody history of regicide and coups. That's self-destabilization. No outside help was needed. So there you go. The U.S. never supported Al-Qaeda. As Bill Murray would say, that's the fact, Jack. So, book recommendation. 10 Global Trends That Every Smart Person Should Know by Ronald Bailey and Marion L. Tupy. It's a much nicer book than the last one I recommended. This shows all the advancements we've made, mostly as countries have accepted capitalism rather than communism, over the last 50-odd years. Things have gotten much, much better. People don't realize that. This book will give you the facts and the evidence to back it up. These are all taken from commonly cited sources like World Bank, stuff like that. So you've got everything from, the number of people affected by malaria and how that's gone down, and how many kids are in school, and democracy, and how many countries are now democratic that weren't, say, back in 1955, or farmland and how that's being used efficiently. Great stuff to show that the world is getting better. Now, as always, if you disagree, feel free. Have the facts to back it up, but feel free to disagree. You can do so in the comment section below, or just send me an email.